Eric, man, thank you so much for coming on the show here today. Super excited to have you on and just reconnect. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I can't remember how long it's been since I was on here. I think this might be my third cameo, maybe fourth. I'm not sure.
It's been a few for sure.
Yeah. So, the brief version is I co-founded Cressey Sports Performance. We have training facilities in both Hudson, Massachusetts and Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. And that is, something that's largely focused in the baseball industry, where we have not just strength and conditioning, but we also have manual therapy, pitching and hitting skill development. We have analytics. We have physical therapists on site in both facilities. And so there's a lot of moving parts with both those facilities. Additionally, I serve as Director of Player Health and Performance for the New York Yankees. So in that role, I oversee strength and conditioning and nutrition across our organization, which, at most times is over 300 players in multiple countries, all over the place. And then I do some writing, some speaking, some product creation, and I have a podcast of my own as well. So on top of that, dad and husband, I have 3 daughters and a very patient wife, as you can probably imagine.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know how you do it all, but we'll talk about that later.
Sure.
And I think this is probably your 5th time total. Nice. I would be shocked if it's not at least 4 or 5. Yeah, you're definitely up there.
I'm sold on
it's probably been. So I know it's been at least a year or two, which is too long, but what's new in your world? What's been going on since the last time we chatted?
Yeah, for sure. So, to be honest, I don't know how much is necessarily new. I think there's always like an evolution of, what you learn and how you do your jobs and get more efficient and things like that. So, this is actually my 5th year in professional baseball. I want to say I came on maybe in the off season before my 3rd one. So we've been through the highs and the lows. We were American League East champions in 2022, and then we had a rough patch last year. So we've kind of seen both ends of the spectrum on the pro baseball side of things, but certainly at the facility. It's been an interesting time because we actually are working through a pretty big expansion at our Florida location. Just one of those things where we moved in there in the end of 2019, and it was kind of like this showcase dream facility. And I don't think we did a really good job of anticipating what would happen when, our business grew and our staff grew exponentially. So we're actually looking into some pretty hefty expansion projects in conjunction with the city, just to give our staff more space to, move around and actually have their own offices, and then also a chance to, expand our offerings and deliver a higher quality product to our athletes.
Yeah, that's awesome, dude. That's awesome. And we kind of talked before the show, but kind of my focus here with this show, we're definitely going to talk some X's and O's, because I would be remiss to get a guy of your stature and not talk X's and O's. But I also want to talk about the coaching journey a little bit, because you and I are both, you're over 20 years now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've been doing this for a little while. And so what I would love to start with, just super broad, super general, what originally got you into coaching? Because I don't know if I know.
Yeah, it's funny. I think like a lot of people, it's like those who can are the athletes and those who can't are the coaches.
Yes.
What's interesting, I was a soccer and tennis player through high school. I always joke I was a fantastically mediocre athlete. Like my upside was probably maybe an average Division II player. I was, all state in tennis, all conference in soccer, and tennis really kind of blew up my shoulder. It was never something that was working well, and kind of got bad as my senior year rolled around. I managed to power through it. I worked at a tennis club for 8 summers growing up and all this stuff, but actually had my sights set more so on playing college soccer, just because the shoulder was bad, and to be honest, I was a little more passionate about the soccer side of things. So I wound up basically after my senior year, I really committed myself. I was known as a player who had good ball skills, understood the game well. I kind of grew up around it. I had a brother that was 4 years older than me, so I grew up playing against all his friends, but I was kind of the pudgy kid. Didn't really have the physique for it. Wasn't fast enough to basically, to play at that next level. So I distinctly remember kind of like a period in like late October of my senior year where I was like, I need to just do this right. And I just kind of flipped the switch and, started eating differently, training way more, all that stuff, just pushing. And, like anything else, I think when you're 17 at the time, like everything works until it doesn't. And I was a guy, our family, we have kind of like eating disorders in our history. We have kind of like this very obsessive compulsive way. So I'm a very type A guy. And for me, kind of just kept pushing the bar higher and higher. And it transitioned to being like a, actual like eating disorder / exercise addiction, and I wound up losing too much weight after, it worked for a while. So what's interesting is I wound up being All-State in tennis my senior year in high school. And when they announced All-State, I was actually in a hospital, and I read it in the newspaper that it had been announced.
Oh my gosh.
Health had kind of deteriorated so fast. So had to go through, kind of a couple hospitalizations, just kind of not just getting my mind right, but getting my body right, regaining weight the right way. And that kind of transitioned into my freshman, even, sophomore year at college. And I realized as I was going through that, obviously wasn't playing college soccer as I was trying to just get healthy, but I realized I was very passionate about that and not so much my accounting major that I had, pursued. So, it was kind of a two-pronged thing that led me down this path to this industry was, getting healthy myself, learning how to gain some weight back the right way, paying attention to proper nutrition and diet, and then also kind of taking care of a bum shoulder through that whole process. So I'd started my first 2 years at Babson College, like I said, thinking I was going to be an accountant. I wound up transferring to the University of New England, which was closer to home. And I was really, really lucky because, my management credits from Babson were kind of worth their weight in gold wherever I transferred. So I did a double major in sports management and exercise science. And UNE is the only medical school in Maine. So it's actually a real big blessing in disguise because, I had access to gross anatomy and just a lot of higher level offerings in terms of being near PTs, ATCs, OTs. So it was a fringe medical education in a lot of ways. So I did that for a couple of years, graduated back in 2003, and I got accepted to the University of Connecticut for graduate school, which I was very lucky. I think I was one of 2 or 3 master's students accepted that year. It was the #1 kinesiology grad program in the country. I kind of pulled a good GRE score, I think, out of a hat, luckily, and it opened the door for me. And what was great about UConn is I went there not knowing what I wanted to do in kind of this health and human performance world. It could have been research, it could have been actual strength and conditioning. It could have been a lot of different things. And, I spent some time volunteering in the lab. Actually, my grad assistantship was funded by the U.S. Army in a study that looked at, potential countermeasures to prevent stress fractures in basic training recruits. But really what I caught the bug for strength and conditioning was I had started doing some writing in this space, early on when both of us were kind of contributing on T-Nation, stuff like that. And one of the graduate assistant strength coaches there was a guy named Brajesh Patel, who was NSCA strength coach of the year last year. Black hockey when they won a national championship. But Brajesh was a year or 2 older than I was. He was a GA there. And I remember we were in class together, and he was like, "Hey, I've read some of your stuff. It's really good. If you ever want to come down and hang out at strength and conditioning, let me know. We'd love to have you. We got men's baseball at 5:30 a.m. tomorrow." It was almost like a test in hindsight, but I'm like, let's do it. So I showed up and kind of instantly fell in love with it. I always tell B it was something I realized probably 10 years later, how good he was at controlling a room, at, using athletes' names, understanding how to position himself. He was dropping external focus cues before I even knew what they were. He probably didn't even know it either, but it just, to me, was a very transformative experience seeing him do his thing, and led me to do more volunteer work on the strength and conditioning side. I was really fortunate to have a great mentor in Chris West, who at the time was really handling men's and women's basketball and soccer. So he had 4 #1 teams in the country in his weight room. At the time, Andrea Hootie had just moved on, and she had been, a kind of a brief mentor there. We stayed in touch over the years, but Tina Murray was there as well. She did a great job. She went to Louisville, and then Sacramento Kings, I think now is Pittsburgh Penguins. So it was just a really great place to be at that time. Obviously, we had a great human performance lab with Dr. Kramer and Dr. Marish and Jeff Volek, and just incredible people. So I look back, and it was kind of like an incubator at UConn in the early 2000s that gave me a really multifaceted experience, and ultimately led me to want to be in strength and conditioning. The baseball niche kind of found me after I left UConn, though. Just some of the first guys I worked with in the private sector were baseball players, and it kind of snowballed from there. And now here we are training guys from all 30 organizations, and me kind of overseeing it for one of the largest, sports brands in the world.
Yeah, that's amazing, dude. And of course, Steve the Cat's going to try and make an appearance. Wouldn't be a podcast without Steve. One of the things that's interesting, you kind of gloss over it here, is this whole idea of writing. But I want to circle back to that for a minute before we get too far down the timeline, because, before there were content creators, there were guys like you and I that were just out there writing articles. So I'd love to hear that story as well. What got you started writing, and what made you want to be a writer?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I'll say is I owe my mom, a great debt of gratitude for a million reasons, but in particular, relative to the conversation for this, she taught ninth grade English, really the whole time I was growing up, and eventually became curriculum coordinator and then principal in my old high school. So I really grew up around books just nonstop. It was never forced on me, but, I always remember her reading every night, correcting papers in bed before she would go to bed. So I was really around it. And whether they were, very, overt efforts or subtle efforts to make me a better writer. It's just something that I think came naturally from being around it for an extended period of time. Where writing was really helpful for me, I'm very transparent. I'm not a good speaker. I never considered myself a good speaker. My mind gets going really fast. My mouth can't keep up with it. It's like Chris Farley and Tommy Boy when he's crushing the bread, right? That's me when it comes to speaking. So I've had to make a conscious effort to slow myself down. But what it lent itself to was me recognizing that writing was a much better way for me to articulate, various things. And it was also a great way to wrap your head around them. It's a way to organize your thoughts. And so I really wrote more than anything else, because it was a way to understand things better and to research things better and to try to grasp them in a way that I thought would help me to teach. And it made me a better coach. It allowed me to utilize analogies more and just understand how to organize my thoughts so I could, converse with athletes. And then, as time goes on, you evolve your writing style, quite a bit just because attention spans have changed over the years. But it was always for me a really, good way just to get my head on straight and teach. And I think that's the best way to learn is to try to teach something.
Yeah. That was always it for me. I always felt compelled to, hey, I've learned this thing. Now I want to teach somebody else, but I couldn't agree more. Like for me, I felt like in a lot of ways it was almost selfish because I felt like I got as much out of it as anybody else would. It's like, man, I never thought of this thing like that or in this way. And so now, by virtue of me going through this, now I can relay it better to the clients and athletes I work with. So I just felt like it made me such a better communicator by doing that kind of stuff.
I look back and, I don't even know if internet forums are really even a thing. Like I haven't bothered to look for one in 10, 15 years. Like I kind of recognize that was not a productive use of my time after an extended period of time. But, I know we were both very active on a number of forums back in the day. And a lot of those, people became, effective writers and, published authors. Cosger was on there. Louis Schuler, guys that were doing really, really good stuff. Mike Boyle still, super active on a forum. So I think, you did a lot of writing back then, even if it wasn't published or anything like that. It was just, it was bantering back and forth in a time when, the internet was to some degree still in its infancy, but it was a way for us, young, enthusiastic coaches to get access to information better because there wasn't, like Instagram wasn't around, Twitter wasn't around back then. Like the 2000 to 2007 era, there was a lot of information exchanged in those mediums that I think helped a lot of us. I was actually talking with Matt Blake, our pitching coach, with the Yankees, who was our first pitching coordinator at CSP. And he's like, young guys don't realize how easy they had it. Like it's all out there. You had to rate a bookshelf, 15 years ago. Now you can just go online.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd say the hardest part now, at least for young coaches, is accruing the filter, right? Yeah. Because it's just information overload. And when you see 30 different people with 30 different solutions to the same problem, it's like, okay, how do you understand? Like, who really knows what they're talking about? Who's had success? Who's just like the flash in the pan that can make a really good reel or TikTok or whatever? Like, that's the hardest part now. It's not like finding the information. It's actually like, is this information valuable, pertinent? Is it going to help me improve the training that I'm trying to do?
The filter is important. To be honest, I actually saw a video this morning. I think it was Steve Young interviewing Tom Brady, and Brady was talking about why so many young quarterbacks struggle, and it's because like he basically postulated that it's because you have these offensive coordinators they're really playing probability. Like, hey, it's 3rd down and 6. They're going to play this defense, so I'm sending this play in. But goes into the quarterback, and it's an entirely different defense. Then the quarterback has to recalibrate to his probability and do like all these different things. And I think we realize that there are a lot of young fitness professionals who are staring at a client and they're like, well, Mike Robertson would do this, and Eric Cressey would do this, and Bill Hartman would do this, and Luke Wilson would do this, and they're completely overwhelmed. So they actually struggle to formulate an opinion of their own. And I think that's something that
Right.
we did better back then. I mean that not in a disparaging way. I think it was just that we had fewer competing demands for our attention, but it was much
Yes.
easier 15 to 20 years ago to come up with your philosophy. And I'm not saying that philosophy I had, like I look back at the programs I wrote in 2007, they're terrible, but I do
Right.
realize things that we did well. And what you didn't do was throw out 80% from one weekend seminar. What you did was you came back, you recalibrated on the 1% to 2%. Maybe you coached an exercise a little bit differently. Like you didn't stop squatting, but you stopped yelling arch to everybody, right? Like
Right.
there were different
Right.
corrections
Right.
that made it work. So I just think too often we get people who get exposed to a new philosophy and they pivot instantly. And if you're a client or an athlete, you walk in, you're like, so everything we've been doing for the last 6 months was terrible now, and we're doing this instead.
Right.
We're just going to pivot. I'd much rather have like our athletes come back from a long season and they walk in and they like, hey, this one's new. Like, why are we doing this? What's different? All this, like where
Yeah.
they see those few things, especially when you have athletes that have been with you for an extended period of time. I love that. I worry more about like completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, no, I agree. I always tell people, I want you to think about everything that I present on over a weekend seminar, but don't go back and change everything right away, right?
Yeah.
Take one or two things, start to tweak it. In the background, you can marinate on all these other things and how they might impact your training or how it might evolve, but don't throw everything out that you've been doing for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Doesn't
Absolutely.
work. So
Agreed.
So here's something else. When I was creating these questions, like one thing I've always admired about you is I felt like you found your voice so early on in the game. So I'm just curious, for starters, would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, maybe for some good and for some bad. You know, I think there are probably times when that led me to be maybe more closed-minded than I should have been. So I think there's one thing I've corrected on a lot more is to just try to be very, very open-minded. Like I consciously seek out people that, you know, maybe they're not contrarians, but they're people that will challenge me. I love that about staff members, about coworkers. You know, I'm super fortunate, like in both my roles, to have people that'll push. I mean, John O'Neill in Massachusetts, and, you know, Andrew Lissy and Ian Connors, and, you know, pitching and hitting coaches in Florida will do that. My wife, you know, from a business standpoint, my business partner, a business and manual therapy standpoint. And then with the Yankees, you know, we've got a collection of super smart people across, you know, all the departments. Like, it's an opportunity to be like the dumbest person in the room way more often. So I think I embrace that a lot. And I think where that maybe it's a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? Like I was the youngest guy ever to speak on the Perform Better tour. Like I spoke at in January of 2007 when I was 25 years old. And I remember Alan Cosgrove came up right after me. He's like, hey, that Eric Cressey kid's pretty smart. Do you think he's ever kissed a girl? And the crowd erupted. But like to some degree, like I think maybe I projected too much of like, this is right because I said so. And in hindsight, like that wasn't who I was. Like I always prided myself on being like that guy from a small town in Maine that was super approachable and all that. So I think that was probably an overcorrection that was maybe a fault of mine at a younger age. And I've really tried to pivot on it, you know, in the years that followed.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you say that because something that I firmly believe is that everybody that's a great coach, right, or people that I consider to be great coaches that have done this for a long period of time, at some point, they doubted themselves, right? As a coach, as maybe not as a human being, but just like, hey, man, this is a tough industry. So maybe this kind of dovetails with that. But like, did you ever deal with that? Because people would look at you now, right? The Eric Cressey, right? Hundreds of thousands of IG followers working for the Yankees. I think it would be great to hear, like, did you ever struggle with your confidence as a coach?
Yeah, you know, I'll say this. Honestly, as a coach, no. I always, you know, tell our athletes, like, you trust your preparation, you're in a great spot, right?
Yeah.
Like, the people who don't prepare, you know, those are the ones that should be really, really concerned. I think, you know, the one thing I think is probably pretty non-negotiable if you talk to the people like I've worked with. I mean, Tony Gentilcore was my roommate for 2 years. He saw me just like, hey, I'm going to go to my room and write a book. I'll see you in a couple of days. Like I was that kind of guy. So I never really had a problem with working and preparing and all that. And I think a lot of that honestly was a function of training as a power lifter. Like I had no problem kind of flipping the switch, being crazy and trying to move a lot of weight relative to my body weight. So I think that in a lot of ways that prepared me for everything from running a business to having twins, to, splitting time between different states and being obviously in a very high pressure role where people are calling for my head pretty much on a daily basis. I don't mind that at all. I'd say the only time, where I think there have been doubts, is on the financial side of things. Like business is tough because, so I invested everything I owned in starting CSP in 2007. It was I was young, I was naive. It was like, all right, I'll spend $127,000 and because I don't know what else to do with my life. So we did it. And if I put that money in the market, I would have lost half of it the next year and a half when the bottom fell out. Instead, I put into a business appreciated, but we grew out of that space in 2008. And then in 2012, we jumped to our showcase location, which was a big financial expenditure in Massachusetts. In 2014, we opened up in Florida, which was another big financial expenditure. And then we outgrew that space and we built our own building in 2009. So here, 07, 08, 12, 14, 19, and here we are in 24 about to make another hefty financial investment. So the doubt comes in business when you have to really ask yourself, like, am I, bursting at the seams? Is this the right move to deliver a better client experience? Is bigger better or is better better? And those are the things that you have to weigh is like, does this expansion improve our client experience? Does it improve my quality of life? Does it take time away from our girls and my wife and all that? So I think those are the places I've doubted myself way more than the X's and O's of training or anything like that. I also I'm sure you wrestle with this as well as like, being a parent, like, every minute you say yes to somebody else, you say no to your kids. And that's a really hard thing to really align yourself. So when I do those days and like, in October when all the baseball guys are getting back and I know I've got to do like 9 evaluations in a day and it's going to absolutely beat me up and I'm going to get back after bedtime. Like, you can't have too many of those days. You can do them sometimes. So, we're here during spring training and I'm away from my kids for 8 days right now just because that's kind of what it takes. So I think that's where the doubt comes in is way more in terms of like understanding your opportunity cost, both in terms of time with your family, your financial investments, stuff like that. To me, the training is very easy. Like if I was just going to go not run a business and I was a single dude in my 40s, I actually don't think I would have a very stressful life at all.
Okay, man, there's a couple great points here. First of all, your tolerance to risk in 2007 versus 2024, probably a lot different, right? Yeah. And not to say that the financial, numbers aren't growing, but just like, look, when you're 20 something and it's just you, hey, whatever, I'll be all right versus no, now you've got yourself, Anna, your girls, like there's a lot there, right? There's just a lot more risk involved. So you're always conscious of that. But it's a really interesting way that you answer that because I never thought about it like that. Yeah, like if all I had to do was show up and coach people, like if people just showed up and my gym and I coach, dude, that would be the easiest job on the planet. How do I do that? How do I make that happen? I would love that.
Yeah, Pete, my business partner, Pete and Mass, has always talked about it. It's like nobody starts a business being like, I can't wait to have 30 employees. Like, no, you can't wait to build something cool that you feel like you're, a huge part of to deliver value to the marketplace and all that stuff. But you don't realize that like there are going to be days when running that gym is no different than running a restaurant or running an accounting practice or, anything like that. It's very different. And to be honest, like actually I think it's kind of cool because it's allowed me to nurture a lot of relationships or, friendships across disciplines. Like, there's a family down the street who are, they're great friends. And, we have a little like neighborhood gym in our HOA that sometimes if I'm like up early and I just want to get a quick session in, like I'll just go work out. And he's often there and he owns like a kitchen / bathroom remodeling company and like a plumbing service.
Oh yeah.
We were talking a couple weeks ago about stuff like you can hit it off with anybody who's in entrepreneurship. So I do think there are benefits that come from it. You can relate to a different kind of people that you might not otherwise know.
Yeah. One other thing you mentioned, it was a little bit ago, but I think it's very valuable is that keeping that open-mindedness as you do this. And I think in some ways it's easier, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of ego. There's a lot of bravado when you're younger. And let's be honest, it's built up. It's a thing in our industry, right? That you have to like have this projection of who you are and you know what you're doing. And I think it gets easier to soften that stance as you get older, to be a little bit more open-minded. But yeah, something you said I think is very valuable is trying to surround yourself, number one, with other like-minded individuals in the sense that They want to grow, they want to get better, multidiscipline. So if you're a strength coach, find personal trainers, find massage therapists, rehab professionals, sport performance, like in the sense of like sport specific people. Find all those people, but then also find people that will challenge your thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that you and I can both agree with, right? It can be uncomfortable, right? Especially if that's not something that you are comfortable with. But man, it will make you a better practitioner when you get surrounded by other people that think similar. They think similarly. They want to get better, but they're also willing to challenge some of the things that you might hold dear to you.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, because when you start a business, the last thing you want to do when you're one person, you want to go to two, is replicate yourself, right? You complement yourself. So when we started up originally, it was like, hey, Pete, can you handle all the managerial stuff, and I'll handle all the technician stuff, and we'll kind of meet in the middle on all the entrepreneurial stuff. Like, as we grew, we did meet people that could replicate me, like, who could handle some of these tough evaluations.
Yeah.
Programs, and could really be strong foundational coaches when I'm not there, because you want to set yourself up for never having to work 90-hour weeks. Like, there has to be a chance to take a crack. So I think that part of it is vitally important, but it takes so long to get there. Like I said, you have to go through those uncomfortable periods of growth. Like, are we busy enough to justify this move?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that you had mentioned was that you weren't a baseball player, right? Mm-hmm. You had some of the shoulder stuff, but we'll come back to that later. But you started coaching a little bit of baseball at Connecticut.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how you really got entrenched in the space, because I think that's a story that a lot of people need to hear, because a lot of people think, oh, well, I didn't play that sport. How can I be an expert in that sport? So talk to me about your journey just within baseball to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think big overarching thought is like, if you want to build a business, solve a problem. And I didn't know that I was doing that in the moment. But when I went to the private sector, it just so happened some of the first guys I saw were baseball players. And it was, basically 2005 to 2007, 2006 to 2007 in Massachusetts. And I was lucky. I got some high school players. One of them wound up being state player of the year. Went 12-0 that season. They won a state championship, and my phone kind of started ringing off the hook. But even prior to that, you realize very quickly that these were guys that were very underserved. I mean, they weren't just weak, which appealed to me as a power lifter, but, they were positionally weak in the spots that mattered, which appealed to me as a guy with a bum shoulder. And I also thought just in general, they had been, coddled a little bit too much. I was also lucky, like one of those guys, I say lucky, it's terrible in hindsight, but he got a stress fracture in his back. So he was in a back brace. So I was like picking up on, not just like, the trends in that, but also understanding like the common injuries that we see in those populations. So I just had a little bit more awareness in there. And I think what you realize more often than not is like, just by being in those circles, your network expands. You meet more and more doctors and physical therapists that are working in that realm. You're motivated to try to find solutions. You're reading journal articles, and you're doing whatever you possibly can to be immersed in it. We were lucky. We were inside of a baseball facility early on, and I think a lot of it has to do, with just getting results early on. Like, I think anybody can get results, but I think we got results and we're willing to like step away and make sacrifices in other places to grow the business. And things really took off by leaps and bounds. But, the other thing is like, you've got to prove value. Like we trained pro guys for free for a couple of years before we ever thought about charging them. You have to deliver value to prove to them that, you're actually good. It's very different having someone who, is doing this for a living, who's going to drop everything and move across the country to train with you, than it is, a high school kid who works out down the road. So I think that was a very kind of transformative time when we realized that people were actually relocating just to train with us.
So talk to me about that, because I know you've mentioned that before, and as a business owner, it's counterintuitive. You're training people for free. How did that discussion go down? Like, how did that come about?
It kind of just happened because I think we agree, like early on, like you train anybody and everybody, right? Programs for family members. Sure. You're just trying to get experience, and that's where we were. And we had a viable business, so we had the wiggle room to do it. But I think it was just one of those things where it was like one of those. This guy was a roommate of one of our existing clients. And you also realize, like, if you're training a bunch of high school players, your gym's pretty darn empty before 3 p.m. each day. You have all this time in the middle of the day. Why not take 12 to 3 and turn it into a great pro dynamic and, really try to learn in the process? So those athletes were teaching, me far more than I was teaching them in those early years. Right. But, it was a couple years in, and, we got some big breaks with some of the, higher level, pro guys in the area that were referred to us through agency connections, or actually, a doctor that, would refer guys to us too. So that definitely helped our cause early on. But, we never set out to just be the baseball place. It kind of just happened over the course of time. I think I would have been much more calculated in it if I was going to do it over again, and I could have done it much faster. But
Sure.
it served us well. One thing that I've also recognized that, may be a good lesson for the coaches out there who are starting businesses, you want your business to be as sticky as possible, right? Like, so with you, right, guys come in and do their strength and conditioning with you, but they got their skill work on the court right next to them, right? And maybe they're seeing Bill for physical therapy or manual therapy at the same time. Maybe they got a favorite restaurant that's on that same block or something like that. If you come to CSP, like, a lot of guys take part in manual therapy, physical therapy, pitching, hitting, strength and conditioning, all of it. Maybe they get nutrition advice there. Maybe they have an analyst on our staff who's, helping them to, plan out how they attack hitters, whatever it is. And then we have a facility where they can do everything in one place, where they don't have to hop in the car and drive over town. So it makes your business a little bit more sticky and helps with retention. I think that would have been the avenue I would have picked for growing this faster back in the day, is found a way to add extra, offerings that would make this place a little bit more sticky on the early end.
I like that. Okay, so another question I have, and it'll kind of tie into what you were just talking about, because obviously you were a power lifter, right? Like, you pushed some really impressive weights, but you and I were interesting in the sense, and I'm going to put myself kind of in the same category as you, but like, we were both serious about strength, right? We were talking about strength training, but at the same time, we were like playing both ends of the spectrum, right? Because we're talking about, how do we get strong, squat more weight, deadlift more weight, bench press more weight? But on the other side, we're like, hey, but this is how you stay healthy.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear, like, what brought those two together for you? For me, it was always about, how do I lift weights and not break myself, right? So that was the two ends and the polarity I was playing with. But what brought you kind of into those two realms as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. Like, I think I took from my powerlifting experience far more of the culture and the energy than I did just the importance of strength. Because we both know, like, you go to a high level powerlifting gym, those guys are all in like debilitating pain all the time. They got cranky shoulders, they're lubing them up with Red Hot, and their hips are killing all the time. Like, I took much more of the culture of guys like pushing each other hard and the energy and all that sort of things. Like, I wanted to bring that into the private sector, with better programming and, and good energy. So I think that part of it was really important to me. Like, relative to this whole concept of strength, like, I think we all agree strength can be protective. Obviously, it has significant performance and benefits, particularly early on in an athlete's training career. Like, I think in hindsight, and you'd probably agree, like, I thought strong, how strong is strong enough was a much higher bar, for lack of a better term. You realize now more often than not that there are some guys who are actually shockingly weak competing at the highest level and staying healthy doing so, because they get, they're successful by different avenues and things like that. I'm not advocating being weak or anything like that. I'm just advocating being understanding of how different athletes have different strategies for accomplishing great movement. I think we obviously look at narrow versus wide in for Sterlango. We see athletes that are very muscularly driven versus fascially driven. I think, we can batch athletes better than we ever have before, but seen a lot of really hypermobile guys that can do crazy things with their bodies that aren't nearly strong enough relative to our expectations, that have made a lot of money playing professional baseball. So I think I'm better now than I ever was, 15 years ago, meeting athletes where they're at. The other one too that I think has been very transformative for me, I'm using that word a lot on this podcast, but just how I deal with aging athletes. And for me, aging is probably over age 33. Typically if an athlete's gotten to that age, they've had some career success. Like, if you're not good by 33, you're probably not still employed as a professional athlete. But I've been fortunate to work with some really good ones that have, sustained onto the back half of their 30s. And I've learned so much from those athletes. I think a lot of it ties in with some of the different things we've looked at with, just how the fascial system changes over a course of time and how ligamentous laxity goes down. And just, you see some very different things in those populations. But I'm always shocked at how easily strength sticks around for those athletes. Like, they can tickle it once a month and it's there. 2 sets of 4 every 5 to 6 weeks can get them what they need to be. Like, and 2020 was actually a really defining year for us, because we had all these athletes that, trained with us pandemic happens. They had only been gone for 3 weeks. They came back from a full off season, and we're like, all right, what do we do? And some of these guys were here for a couple months with us once the gym opened back up, and they played a 60-game season. So most of them were basically gone July 1st until early October. Some played a little bit longer in the postseason. But we had guys that walked back in and they were trap bar deadlifting like 500 for 5 on the first day of the off season. It's like,
oh my,
all right, what do we do? And for those guys, we basically trained like athletes way more that off season. We used Proteus a ton. We threw the med ball extra. We sprinted, we changed direction, we jumped, we bounded, we skater jumps, all that stuff. We integrated a ton more rotational patterning in our programs. And saw some of the best velocity increases we've ever seen. And not only that, just guys that around like December, January, when the throwing volume really started to ramp up, there weren't as many aches and pains. And some of it was sure that these guys had like just a down year in terms of volume. They didn't get beaten up nearly as bad.
Sure.
But I do think that we were stumbling onto some things by accident, and they've been very big difference makers for us in the years that followed, particularly some of those guys that were there that are still with us, now 4 years later. Like, we realized that same level of strength is present, like when they come back each year. So you really need a good month to get their strength reserve where it needs to be. And then you can focus on a lot of the other qualities at the same time.
Dude, I love that. I was literally just talking about this the other day, and you know this as well, but like the young developing athlete, totally different monster, right? Yeah. You're trying to teach them how to develop intensity. You're trying to build some of those base physical qualities. But especially with these older athletes that have had success, like you alluded to, their late 20s, 30s, late 30s, it's all about, I just call it touching intensity, right? Yeah. You just got to touch it every now and then, right? You don't have to demonstrate it, and they don't want to, right? Like you lift heavy weights long enough, at some point, I remember Joe Ken told me years ago, he's like, oh, there's just days I just don't want to squat or deadlift heavy. And I remember thinking, like, what? And now, I get it. Like, there's just some days you don't want to pick something heavy up.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
Touching intensity.
Yeah, I still love lifting. I've had one orthopedic surgeon. I had a meniscus repair in January of 2021, and I bounced back from great. My knee's awesome, except when I pick up over 550 pounds. It was actually kind of a reminder, like, this is why being morbidly obese is not healthy. Like, people don't walk around weighing 700 pounds because it hurts their joints. And the one thing my knee hates is really, really heavy loading. It's just yelling at me, don't be stupid. And I'm like, all right, I can click 495 and just move it fast. That's okay. Like, I'm not going to waste away. My wife and kids will still love me. My business won't fail if I don't get it anymore. But that was like a very, I guess, eye-opening experience for me, just, having to go through it myself. But, I'm 42 now, so I don't lift quite as heavy as I used to. I still have a lot of fun in the weight room. I'm still there all the time, but the focus has definitely shifted a little bit.
Yeah, I think the primary emphasis right now is to be able to run up and down a soccer field with Kendall, kick a soccer ball, throw BP, and or throw the ball to my dog about 1,000 times because he never wears out. It's like the goals just shift and evolve, right?
It's true. We're just it's really just pulling the parachute. I'm trying to descend a little bit slower, make sure I can go back to playing tennis in retirement whenever that day comes.
I love it. Okay, so another thing that we kind of talked about and alluded to was, you had the shoulder stuff when you were younger, and obviously that sucks. Right? Impacts your ability to play tennis. I know it impacted your ability to like bench press sometimes and back squat. But how do you think that was kind of a silver lining when you got into the world of baseball?
That's a blessing in disguise because the injury mechanisms are very similar, right? It's your classic internal impingement, externally rotated, abducted kick serve. Like, being back in that position is not a great spot for the underside of your rotator cuff or your posterior superior labrum. So for me, it taught me a lot about just the injury mechanisms that overhead athletes encounter. And it's been, helpful for us, not just in baseball, but also with our tennis guys and our, swimmers. And, we see volleyball players, we see, NFL quarterbacks, you name it.
Quarterbacks,
so a lot of those things will carry over across a lot of different populations. So, but I think also just understanding why rehab programs failed. Like, for me, I look back, so just to give you background, I rehabbed for literally like 18 months with this, really like all the way through my senior in high school. And then, kind of came back I stepped away from tennis during college a lot, but it got really, really bad late in college while I was still like working at a tennis club on the side. Basically had gone through rehab the whole summer between my undergrad and my graduate, startup. And we basically agreed late August of 2003 that I was going to come back and have surgery on the first day of my winter break. So basically just deal with a bum shoulder for your whole first semester, and then, be in a sling for a couple weeks and then go back and you should be good to go where, you can actually write and all this stuff. And I just was like, all right, well, I got, this kind of like 4-month period where I can just try a bunch of different things, and found a good ART guy down the street who worked on me, adjusted my training a ton, and really just, locked it in. And I called and canceled my surgery on Halloween. I mean, literally 2 months later, I was in a great spot. So to talk about this idea of like an 8-week magic mark is if you really lock things in for 8 weeks, if you're not doing well by then maybe it's time to advance this to a more, aggressive intervention, like a surgery or something like that. But I think also for me, it made me really wonder why I, had failed rehab, or if rehab had failed me. I had no manual therapy as part of it. There was no discussion of how to modify my training. Like I would still back squat. I would still, try to overhead press. I would try to do things that would flare me up. And there really was no consistent awareness of like what was happening outside of the gym or the rehab clinic. Like I was going and working at a tennis club. I was basically trying to play tennis. Like you can do all the exercise in the world, but if you're, if you got a headache and you keep banging your head against the wall, it's not going to get better. So looking back, it made me realize that you have to control for way more variables, and you have to be exhaustive in the way that you approach things. And you also, you look at a lot of physical therapy clinics, right? It's 6 patients, 1 physical therapist. It's not a great business model. I understand the nature of insurance and all that stuff, but, a lot of bad reps kind of slipped through the cracks, and that's probably in one part, why I didn't get better. So that taught me a lot. And it's something that's really, I think, framed our business, my approach to managing over athletes to this day, just because you talk about shoulder, you talk about an elbow, you're working with a very tight window of what is and isn't acceptable. It's not like a hip where you can just like get away with a lot over an extended period of time. Like you're working in a really finely controlled area.
Yeah. Dude, I've never heard you explain it like that. Very, very cool. The other thing that I think is interesting is just when you're talking about like these different constraints, but also talking about how within your training program, there's so many different avenues and so many different screws you can turn, right? So especially now, you were just thinking training, but there's training, nutrition influence, recovery. You talked about ART, but maybe it's sleep, maybe it's mindset, visualization. Like we're so much more broad in our scope as to how we can address these things now. Again, when we were starting out 20 years ago, right, it was basically, hey, let's maybe not do dumb stuff in the gym. Let's get ART and see what happens. But now all the things that we have access to, man, we can really dive in. And I love that idea of an 8-week magic mark. I've not heard that before, but it gives you a really good time to try some conservative interventions. And then, okay, this isn't working. Now maybe we go to plan B.
I think you kind of outlined that there's so many different things that can contribute to success or failure. I think what it underscores the most is the need to listen to people, to ask a ton of questions, to really pry. I can't tell you, I've lost track of how many teenage athletes with significant musculoskeletal issues have failed to disclose that they're on Accutane. Like significant, potential musculoskeletal side effects. Dermatologists prescribe it. It's a very, kind of sensitive subject. Teenagers don't want to talk about their acne. So very rarely they're listed on a health history, or it's an athlete you've already been training and they start a course of it once they've already been working with you. And all of a sudden it's, it's a left wrist that hurts. And then it's a right shoulder, and then it's a right knee. And then it's like diffuse low back stuff. And you're like, are you just overtrained? Like, did you change your mattress? Like, what happened? You got a crazy new coach that was running you to the ground. And I can't tell you how many times that snuck up on me. And like, frankly, like parents beat themselves up about it because it very rarely is discussed, because usually like the greater good is getting these kids less, sensitive, or not sensitive, but their self-esteem is really heavily impacted by, having some concerns. So like it may be the greater good for some of these kids because they do one course of it and then they can move on afterwards. But it's one of those things, like I've learned to ask, check vitamin D levels, all these different things. I think I'm just more aware of prying than I ever have before. And early in my career, I probably assumed too much and didn't listen for long enough. I think there's a lot more of an inquisitive component to the onboarding. I want to know what's worked, what hasn't, what's made you feel better, what didn't. Talk to me about your previous experience with training. What have you been doing? Because sometimes you look like the smart guy simply because you have the benefit of hindsight. What didn't work before you came to me?
Right. Man, Okay, so first off, if you're listening, this is like the third or fourth time in recent memory that this topic has come up. And Derek Hansen was actually talking about it with the Achilles stuff and how many Achilles issues are potentially driven by some of this. So, hey, if you're working with teenage kids, the Accutane is maybe something you need to be asking about. That's great. The other point that you made that I think is incredibly important is being willing to ask questions and trying to put the person at ease, right? You're not trying to like make them uncomfortable, but like you're really trying to figure out, okay, what are all the different aspects? What are all the different things that are going on with you? And I always try and help them understand or let them know like, hey, this is a safe space. Like the only reason I'm asking these questions because the more information I have, the more I can help you. And so when you kind of let them know that, it lowers their resistance and their threshold a little bit. And hopefully you can get more honest feedback from it.
No doubt about it. I think pro athletes are actually notorious at about underreporting injuries. Like you hand them a health history,
they have so many, right?
And there's that, and they're just sick of filling out paperwork. You know, they're they got to go through all the onboarding. Like, you know, it's a barrage when you come into spring training in baseball. It's vision, it's dental, it's EKG, it's blood, it's urine, it's and then it's obviously all the Q&As and stuff like that. There's so many different layers to it that they're just tired of it, so they kind of skim over stuff. And sometimes they can not report something that's like, hey, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you don't tell me, that's a really big deal.
Right.
Beyond just the fact that you could die on our training floor if you took too much insulin, like it increases your risk of frozen shoulder if you have a surgery. There's a lot of layers to this. And I to the athletes out there, the best thing you can do is over communicate. Yeah,
for sure. So one thing that I really enjoy is getting people's long-term perspective on training, health, and performance, especially somebody like you, been in the space 20 plus years now. You're working with some of the most elite athletes, not just in sport, but in the world. So I would love to hear you describe like your current philosophy or approach to keeping the athletic shoulder healthy. Like if you had to give me your position statement right now, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, there are parts of it that evolved and parts that haven't. So what I'll say first is that I don't think this is specific to shoulders, but sports in every single capacity are played at higher levels than ever before, right? Like, I sat second row at the U.S. Open for one of our pro tennis guys. Like watching guys serve 150, like is insane to me. And they've even made the tennis balls a little bit heavier on tour, so we're seeing like an increase in shoulder and elbow stuff in that world that is very openly discussed. In baseball, average fastball velocity has gone up every year for 20 plus years. The game is just played at such high levels. NFL, it's a car accident on every single play. Obviously, you hear about the Achilles and all this different stuff. Is just that people are pushing the limits of human performance so high right now that sports medicine is literally just trying to keep up. So what I always come back to is like we're seeing anterior dislocations in throwing shoulders. Like that was usually something that you saw in a rugby collision. But we're seeing guys that too saucy on a weighted ball program, and they literally dislocate their shoulder anteriorly. I think the concerning part is also that it's happening really, really young. Like some of the studies, there was a study on Japanese asymptomatic 12-year-old elbows. Like over 60% of them already had UCL damage. And that was asymptomatic kids. That didn't even include the ones that actually hurt. So I think this is a multi-pronged discussion. So I'll speak with it as best as I can to dumb it down to any injury. I think every injury is a difference between load and capacity. And if we understand that dynamic, we can always break things down further. From a capacity thing, like there has to be time to achieve a training effect, right? And that could be everything from tissue extensibility to tissue strength, elasticity. It could be, the actual density of the tissue. Like I think we're seeing better and better research in like the fascial community about, what that means as well. So, and then certainly the load is something that we have to manage. And those two things are remarkably interwoven. And I think what we're seeing right now across sports is that the load on athletes is higher than ever before because there's more opportunities to play, to compete, particularly at younger ages. And at the same time, there's less and less training time that enhances capacity. So what we're doing is we're really just shifting the balance on the seesaw in potentially the wrong direction. And so what we're now seeing is we're seeing young athletes who develop structural defects at a young age. And what we're hearing about is when they turn, 23, or 24, something like that, they get to these higher levels. the speed of execution on everything goes up, and eventually that structural limitation becomes a problem. So in the baseball world, what happens, you have an ulnar collateral ligament. It's basically a small ligament on the inside of your elbow that, keeps your hinge as a hinge. And when you lay your arm back, there's medial gapping on your elbow. And what we see very commonly there, kids have low-grade injuries to this when they're young. They're still learning how to throw. They go out and they make a 90-pitch outing in Little League or something like that. And they don't necessarily notice it, but they're actually laying down calcification on the ligament that eventually becomes a point of weakness. They get bigger, they get stronger. 2 years of college strength and conditioning, and they're throwing 94, and the ligament goes, and they go in, and sure enough, there was an existing level of calcification that was there. The problem, though, is that used to happen at 24, 25, 26. Yeah. Now we're seeing 15-year-olds that are having Tommy John. I mean, I've seen it in a 12-year-old, which is astounding to me.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's very debated in the industry, like how long the useful life of an elbow. I don't think anybody would say it's more than 10 years, though. Like, it's probably more in the ballpark of 8 to 10 because the native ligament is always going to be stronger than the reconstruction. Now we're seeing hybrid procedures where they do an internal brace on top of that reconstruction. But, you have these guys that are now, we have multiple guys that we work with who have had 2 Tommy Johns, like where they're just, they're running out of graft sites that you can take from. There are a few guys that have had 3. So it's a very strange world when kids are blowing out that young. And baseball is probably the most extreme example. It's very different than like an ACL or, just like someone who pulls a hamstring or something like that. This is a small ligament that has to go through a really significant biological process of, ligamentization, where that tendon has to become a ligament. It's 14 months on the shelf for your first Tommy John, usually about 16 for your second. So sports medicine just can't keep up with the injuries that are taking place. But, to dumb it down to the most minute way to look at it is load and capacity are imbalanced. So independent of how a shoulder moves, bad things are going to happen. Now, if we want to make capacity better, we find an element of neutrality in the shoulder, right? We get, adequate thoracic spine mobility. We get adequate scapular upward rotation. We learn to keep the ball in the socket. I'll give you one fast one that I think is something that you can carry over across, different disciplines. I was actually talking about this with our director of pitching yesterday. I think posterior tilt, both at the hip and the shoulders, is the biggest unlock in terms of movement in the body, right? We know if you take a heavy extension bias athlete, you find posterior tilt, good things are going to happen. Even if they're like a raging left AIC, they're out of whack. If you get them right sagittally, there will be a downstream effect to frontal and transverse plane. I think with the shoulder, it's the absolute truth. If you can find just a little bit of posterior tilt, it's a total unlock for athletes. They get cleaner external rotation. They don't default to anterior tilt in place of internal rotation. When it comes to upwardly rotate, if you have someone who's really anteriorly tilted, it's so far to posteriorly tilt and then rotate around the rib cage that they'll just throw this, like, especially older adults, they'll throw this shrugging pattern at you. They don't have a chance in heck at like trying to actually get to serratus. So I just think in general, like if you're stuck, maybe a bad pun there, but like treat a pec minor, treat a coracobrachialis, treat a short head of the biceps, find a little bit of posterior tilt, teach them what it actually is. Because we see a lot of athletes, they think they're giving that little tilt, and instead what we get is we get this aggressive scapular depression from the lat that comes with this big lumbar extensor tone, or we get rhomboids firing up and we get almost like this military posture. And those guys that have that crazy upper back compression, they got like barnacles growing on their rhomboid. Like you go and you do a upper back expansion, you treat rhomboids, whatever it is, they feel like completely different people. So I think posterior tilt just fixes so much, and that's what I've been getting into what we're talking about, the hips. So there's a shoulder bit for today.
No, I love it. And just to kind of jump off your idea of these young kids having the Tommy Johns, I know they do a lot of MRIs like at the NBA Combine, and they're telling, like, the things that I've heard are guys that are 19, 20 years old are showing up with knees that look like guys in their mid to late 20s.
That's insane.
Right? Because there's just so much volume. Right? It's not just the high school season, it's AAU. And if they're not playing AAU, there's this thing called June Ball that they do here, where they'll go in on a day, they'll go and play 4 games, right? And they'll do that 2 or 3 times a week. So like you said, the load is just massively outpacing the capacity. And then they wonder why they feel beat up and hurt all the time.
And the irony is, think about what you're eating if you're playing 4 games a day. I know because I was around.
For sure.
You're drinking sugar water all day. That's basically,
absolutely.
Maybe you have a bar if you're lucky. You're not eating real meals. And you talk about, like, I remember hearing like the Dwight Howard stories, Chris Paul, like, and I don't follow the NBA super closely, but like nutrition is beyond transformative in the NBA. Like I think Mark Cuban was kind of the first one that really pushed it hard. And now everybody's like, through my role, like we've toured multiple NBA facilities. We have great rapport with, guys like Art Horn and, Todd Wright, like guys who are doing great stuff. And like nutrition is extremely front and center in the NBA. And then you go to these other levels and it's like, no, I'm going to drink sugar all day and play pickup for 8 hours today. And I'll get to the weight room sometime down the road. It doesn't happen. So, I wish more people would recognize what like the highest level guys have actually done to get where they go. Like, if the average like 16-year-old kid like actually came in and saw what some of our like Cy Young Award winners do on a daily basis, like they'd walk in and be like, you know what? There isn't a single thing you did today that would get a like on Instagram. Like it's boring and it's mundane, but you do it every single day. Like you're willing to do the mind-numbing, boring stuff that sets you up for a long-term success.
So I think that's one of the best things about a place like yours, maybe on a smaller level, a place like ours where you've got high school, college, pros all under the same facility, right? And a high school kid can see what an MLB player does or a Cy Young Award winner player does. And you're like, holy crap. Like you said, it's not sexy. It's not exciting, but they show up. They do all their foam rolling, resets, mobility work. They get a good training session in. They're doing the best stuff outside of the gym to take care of their body. Like it's not exciting, but they do it every day, every off season. And just those small wins stacked up over months, years, decades allows them to have that kind of long-term success. Yeah.
Small hinges swing big doors. That's Pat Ridgey-ism. And
I was going to say that's an Eric Cressey. I always hear that one out of you.
It's funny. I think I stole it from Pat, but our staff wears me out about it. I say that way too much. It's become a Cressey-ism. So credit to Pat in the public forum.
Okay. Okay, that's fair. Okay, one more and then we'll start to wrap this up. What was something you thought you knew about shoulders early on that you've had to evolve as your years have gone
on? Chasing humeral extension. I stayed away with it from it for a long time. I think we were always really concerned that throwers had very loose anterior capsules, which they do. So effectively what happens with a thrower is, as they acquire more and more external rotation, the glenohumeral ligaments in the front of the joint kind of give. So you create this anterior glide, and when they get too loose, you can wind up with, chronic biceps tendinopathy because the biceps tends to work hard. You can irritate the cuff. You can tear the ligaments themselves. So what we see is over the course of time, like aging throwers, like those ligaments are less like a trampoline. They kind of become more like thick tissue paper where eventually there's a puncture. So we always were really cautious about protecting against, humeral anterior glide that took place, not just with external rotation, but also with shoulder extension. Anytime the elbow goes behind the body, the humerus is going to want to glide forward in the joint. So that influenced how we coach rows and, think about getting out and around as opposed to just back. But what I think it did do was it made me very, very reluctant to like actually check what shoulder extension range of motion was. And what it probably led me to miss out on was a lot of the benefits of like the crab position, like crab position breathing, like great opportunity to chase some anterior expansion for someone who's compressed front to back. So I think that's been a good one. It's actually like a sneaky good way to teach a little bit of scapular posterior tilt if you do it really, really well. So I think I would have been less resistant to actually checking and potentially even chasing a little bit more humeral extension in certain guys, because it is a motion. Even if you're not going to like load it like crazy, they should preserve. So I think we had some guys that probably got stiff in that realm and maybe developed some downstream consequences that weren't as favorable.
Yeah. One of the things that I feel like I always come back to is that maybe you're not going to load all of these different things, but for the most part, I want people to have access to those ranges of motion, right? Like that's when you really get in trouble. And so I know like somebody will say to me, oh, well, a basketball player, they'll never do this on a court. Right. Okay, great. But what happens if they ever get forced into it, right? Or they lose capacity somewhere else? Now, right? Now the same structure, the same tissue is constantly getting overloaded. I feel like that's when things really get gnarly. Yeah,
I think you're buying amplitude. And you think about like all right, so let's go back. Let's I'm turning the tables. I'm interviewing now. All right, 2010. How is Mike Robertson managing femoral acetabular impingement, even if it's asymptomatic?
Yeah. Oh man. How am I chasing it now versus? Oh yeah, we just like
You're
stretch
not
and maybe do
it.
some activation drills. Yeah.
Exactly. You're just working around it and, trying to control the femoral head with good glute activation, maybe using a band for posterior glide. It's all well and good. And now if that guy's a wide infrasternal angle, we need to, chase some sacral counter nutation. We're hopping him on a slant board. We're deep squatting him. We're cross connecting. We're doing all these things that would have been vilified 13, 14 years. I mean, credit to Bill for opening a lot of people's eyes with this stuff. But you realize that, we were probably contraindicating stuff in a bunch of people that had asymptomatic findings on imaging. 80% of college football players have FAI. It's 100% of NHL players. You're not going to contraindicate an entire group of people from squatting deep. So it's all about the load and how you program it and all that. But we've seen some good benefits just from being willing to, kind of go back and revisit some of these things.
There's a lot of nuance. And I think that's one thing you learn over the years. It's like, instead of just throwing an entire activity out, you realize, okay, what constraints do I have? How can I modify it? How can I make it functional? I'll just put that in air quotes for this person, right? So that ultimately they get a positive training effect from it.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. I know you're pressed. So I've got 5 lightning round questions.
Let's do it.
And then I'll let you go. Okay.
Perfect.
Number 1, this is just more of a statement, but damn, dude, your girls are getting big. The picture from like a week or two ago is like, holy crap, those kids are big.
You're telling me, and they're, I actually got a text from my wife yesterday. They were at the gym with her, and there was a video of our 9-year-old twins trap bar deadlifting with like the 10-pound bumpers on each side. I was like, all right, we're getting there now. So they're all
in the blood.
Yeah, they're all in on, it's gymnastics. Softball are probably the top 2. We got a little bit of dance in there. They played soccer. They weren't big on soccer, which is a little bit of a bummer, but
yeah.
So we're feeling it out as we go. We got a 4-year-old in T-ball now too.
The gymnastics foundation really sets the stage. They can do anything after that.
Yeah.
One of my best soccer girls. Go ahead.
I will say I'm a little nervous about the long term of gymnastics. Just
never competitive.
It's great, but just so many of the teenage girls. Like their wrist braces, they all have the patellar tendon sleeves. There are a lot of spondies. I worry a little bit more about like selling out for it once they get so young. Like I'd rather see it be part of like a big developmental plan, but it's going to be tough if they fall at that level.
1,000%. That was always my thought. Was like, hey, we're going to do this for the general well-roundedness, spatial awareness, athleticism, but never like performance gymnastics, if you will.
Yeah, it's crazy to me too, like how quickly it escalates too. Like I thought it was cool when they did like a cartwheel, and now they're doing like flips off bars and doing just crazy stuff. I'm like, wait, that wasn't there last week. Like that's when it gets a little crazy. So we have 2 balance beams in our living room, and we have bars in place of the dining room table now. So life is speeding up on us.
I love it. Okay, number 2. As we're recording this, you are at spring training. What are your goals for the next couple of weeks, man?
Yeah, spring training. So actually, maybe the best way I can describe it is to describe what a major league organization is to folks. It's different than any other professional sport because there are so many players. So if you look at like major league rosters, 180 players domestically. So think about 6 teams of 30 players apiece, plus your 26-man major league roster. So that's 206 players that are allowed domestically. You can carry 90 guys at your Dominican academy, so 296. And then any athletes that are placed on the full season or 60-day IL don't count towards that number. So you may have over 300 in your organization. And, looking at us, like we have, obviously New York is our major league affiliate. We have our AA and AAA teams both within about an hour of our stadium, and our AA and our high A teams are within an hour. Our AAA team's a couple hours away, and then we have our low A team, which is in Tampa, across the street from our player development complex, and then we have our Dominican academy. So fortunately, they're all in the same time zones, but they're very spread out. So what it speaks to my role in a director of player health and performance, the number one thing that I can do is provide a vision and basically educate. Teach our coaches what I value as important, be available to them as a resource, be an advocate for them for whatever they may need, things like that. So if I try to work with every single athlete every single day, I will fail miserably just because there are so many guys. So this week, and we're actually in the middle. Our pitchers and catchers all reported last week, and tomorrow is the official report date for all the position players. It's kind of like speed dating, so we'll carry a little over 70 guys in Major League camp, and you've got to get to know a lot of them. You probably know 55 of them, and then there are 20 guys that you may not have ever interacted with. So those players come in and they do, like I said, blood work that we scrutinize. They do EKGs, they do movement screens, more classic PT evals that may be strength testing, range of motion assessments, all that. So it's a total barrage of stuff, jump on force plates, all that stuff. So there's a lot to unpack. And our skill coaches are also learning these guys, understanding, what the spin axis on their four seams are. We're looking at them on high-speed cameras. It's a lot, man. So
I can't even imagine, dude.
Yeah, the number one goal is obviously to gather as much information as possible to identify any guys that might be at risk of getting hurt. Particularly, this is the time of year when injuries are the highest, just because you have so many players that are all coming from different places to one spot, and the workload spikes on them. So we scrutinize that really, really closely. We've been fortunate this year to have a lot of guys who have been at our complex training for an extended period of time now. So we're not like getting them all cold turkey, but there are some players that, roll in each day, and, you kind of got to, like I said, speed date them on the fly. So number one goal for now is to, have a gradual onboarding of volume and, skill variance and stuff like that prepares us for, opening day at the end of March.
Yeah. One of the things that always overwhelms me when I talk to guys like you, NBA, NFL, is just all the data streams.
Yep.
So many data streams, man. It's like, dude.
It's fun. If you like, I was going to be an accountant, so I love numbers. I love nerding out.
Yeah, me too.
Do a lot of really advanced medical grading stuff and things like that. So, my role is kind of like a fringe. It's kind of a crossover between, obviously like an in-person strength conditioning coach and, collaborating with performance science, amateur scouting, sports medicine, pro scouting, communicate with our front office on a variety of different initiatives. So it's cool. If you like to, have something new to do each day, that keeps it really, really interesting. So it's a lot of data. You're right.
I love it. Okay. Serious question. How do you do all the things? Right? CSP, Yankees, husband, father, like how on earth do you do it all?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is there are sacrifices, like no doubt about it. Like I miss some of my daughter's games and things like that. So, I think it's just one of those things where, Anna, my wife, and I have like sat down and we've discussed what's important to us, what are the boundaries, what are the non-negotiables and all this, but there have been a lot of sacrifices. I think what is helpful about my Yankees role versus my CSP role is they are perfectly offset. So as an example, when we lost in the American League Championship in 2022, my wife was actually at the game when we lost, and she had a flight booked the next morning for 5:45. So after we lost, I booked a flight on that airplane. We flew out together, and I was back coaching at the facility the next day at 10:45 a.m. Like it was just one of those things where I was like, go right back to it. And partially that's therapeutic. Your season ends on a note that you didn't want it to, so you can kind of like, get right back to work and start taking your mind off it.
Right.
But they are kind of perfectly offset where the facility is very busy in the off season, and then, the in season, role is very, busy on the major league side while the facility is a little quieter. Pete and John really run Massachusetts and do an amazing job up there. So, I don't have a really strong presence there, but we are back up there in the summertime, which, is a place that I do pop in on. But at the end of the day, the reason it works is amazing people, that work with me. Everything from a wife to business partners to great staff members, transformational employees that understand how to lead their departments. And, I think in years past, I've probably gotten in the way too much and micromanaged people. And I think over the years, I've tried to get much, much better about just like, tell them, hey, I'm an advocate for you. Let me know how I can help, but I trust you guys to spread your wings. Go do it.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, what's your best piece of advice for a young, up-and-coming coach?
You got to find mentors. And the most important thing I would say is those mentors are not going to be right down the street. You have to be willing to sacrifice, to travel, to go and do stuff. I wish I had, I was lucky I did have a guy locally who took me under my wing when I was kind of going through some health problems. And, I'm very, very appreciative of his name's Daryl Conant. He was, to this day was life-saving for me in a lot of ways. But I didn't spread my wings till I got to grad school. That was 3.5 hours away from home. So I think internships are like vitally important, not just because they expose you to good mentors or they get you academic credit. Like they get you reps, and it's so hard to get reps on your own. Like, short of like volunteering to train your cousins and your old teammates and stuff like that. Like an internship is an amazing opportunity to just go and get thousands of reps, to stumble a little bit and figure out why a coaching cue didn't work, why you weren't able to get through to an athlete, and you just get better and better at it. So, I think it takes way more than 10,000 hours, if I'm being honest. Like I still find myself finding better ways to communicate. So yeah, go out, get a great internship, and find really, really good mentors. And I want to be very, 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 very clear. It's not a mentorship over email. It's not a online graduate course. I'm not saying those things are bad, but too often people expect like someone to just drop everything and like answer every question they have over email. Like they can teach you way more if you're willing to make sacrifices and be around them on a regular basis, because in many cases they're trying to teach multiple people at the same time. Like if I do an in-service, I don't want to do a one-on-one in-service. Like this is an amazing experience because you're going to have thousands of people that listen to this podcast, right? So there's a trickle-down effect. If, I just get Joe Smith from down the street who wants to talk about strength and conditioning, I talk to him, that's not useful. So like a lot of times there are academic supervisors and professors in college that send guys out to do like career papers and things like that. And you're probably the same. I get probably 10 of those requests a week. Like they want to just come by and shadow and stuff like that. And I'm totally fine with them coming by the facility and seeing things and all that stuff. But it's just so hard to try to give everybody 30 minutes, especially when a lot of people go up prepared with great questions. Like if you can be succinct in your ask, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I'll always answer you, give you a quick email reply. But when there's, hey, what's your philosophy? It's like, like, do you want to hear 2007, 2017, 2027? Right. I think it'll be like those are the ones that are hard. So I don't mean to come across as like apathetic to the future of the profession, but I do think the best coaches out there are the ones that are willing to sacrifice and go out and find those opportunities.
Well, look, let's reiterate something you said earlier. Every time you say yes to something else, you're saying no to your family. Right. Yeah. And I think that's hard to understand when you're 20 or 21 years old, because I've had to have those same discussions. I mean, I would love to help you, but if you're going to come in and do it like on rest periods while I'm coaching. Don't ask to like, let's go have a cup of coffee for an hour. I'm like, and that would be great, but I don't even have time to go have a cup of coffee with my friend for an hour, let alone somebody I've never met.
5:15 while I'm racing to get work done before my daughters wake up. Like that's
exactly.
It's not, I love it. It's not in any way apathy to like the future of the industry. Like there's great things happening out there. It's a great place to get educated, but you just got to find the right path to find the information
and find good mentors. Find good mentors. Okay. Last but not least, number 5, for a guy that's done it all, man, what's next for Eric Cressey?
I mean, the answer during spring training is always win a world championship. It should be the answer year round as well. So, we got some very important irons in the fire to get going with that. And then obviously, on the business side of things, like I said, we have some pretty big expansions. So it's going to be quite a few meetings with contractor, writing some bigger checks than probably ever have had to. But hopefully all with a successful outcome in mind to make the product better for our athletes.
I love it, dude. Man, it's always so great catching up with you. Every time I'm like, damn, it better not be another fill in the blank. It better not be another year before I talk to Eric, because it's always amazing, and I appreciate you coming on, dude. Where can my listeners find out more about you and all the great work you're doing?
Sure. EricCressey.com is just like the web page. And then social media, I'm pretty much at Eric Cressey on Twitter and Instagram. And then probably the thing that might intrigue him the most is the podcast. Maybe some similar genres to what you're talking about, maybe a little bit more of a baseball focus, but we step back and take the 30,000 foot view on some sports medicine stuff and things like that. That's the Elite Baseball Development Podcast.
Perfect. I'll make sure I get all the links in the show notes so you can find it easily. And again, Eric, thank you so much, brother. It was great having you on.
My pleasure. Always good catching up, and I appreciate you having me.